Hello, my name is Jason Theriot. I'm a Cajun from South Louisiana living in Houston, Texas, and I'm a historian and a professional storyteller, so to speak. I own my own little history consulting business, and I've been doing this kind of neat historical work for a number of years. And it's my pleasure to be sitting here with you guys today and telling some stories about the Cajuns from South Louisiana and a bit of our history and our culture and a little bit about my family's background as well, which is all tied into to our Cajun Acadian past. So I was born and raised in a small town in South Louisiana along the Bayou Teche and grew up there in the 1980s and the 1990s. And just like any other kid from that area, we grew up hunting and fishing and playing in the outdoors. Not many people spoke the French language back then. Honestly, the language was on its way from being lost by that time because my grandparents who grew up speaking it did not pass it on to their children, our parents. And so unfortunately, it didn't get passed down to my generation. Since then, there have been efforts that have been put forth to kind of preserve that language through French immersion programs. And so I'm happy to say today that there are more younger people speaking French in school in South Louisiana than there were in my day growing up. But my sort of interest in history and in Acadian history and Cajun history kind of began when I started interviewing World War II veterans in the early 2000s. So I've always been fascinated with World War II. I've picked up the writing bug and started interviewing, not using fancy equipment that we use today, but starting using a little micro cassette recorder and driving around interviewing World War II veterans. And the very first veteran that I interviewed was my grandfather, Hewitt Theriot, who's from this neck of the woods in Lower Terrebonne Parish, which is south of New Orleans. There's a little town called Theriot, where we are all originate from. The name Theriot, our Theriots, are descendants of the Acadians who came from the Canadian Maritime Provinces into Louisiana in the 1760s. More on that later. So the story of the original Acadians goes back to the early 1600s when groups of farmers from communities in France, in the areas around Brittany and Normandy, France, got fed up with the politics of their country and fled and went to find a new life in the New World. And they first settled in a place called Port Royal, which is the main city in today's, one of the major cities of today's Nova Scotia. Okay, and they settled in the area and they kind of migrated into other places. My ancestors, the Theriots and the Bourgeois, settled in a place known as Beaubassin, which was this peninsula that separated Nova Scotia from New Brunswick. So kind of right in that area near the Bay of Fundy. And so this was an area known as Acadie, and the people there were known as Acadians. And their neighbors down the street were the Mi'kmaq Indians. And so all these groups kind of lived together in harmony, and they all spoke French as their primary language, and they lived off the land and off the sea, and they raised their own crops. They were well known, the Acadians were well known for converting flooded marshland and draining it to create fertile soil for growing hay, wheat, and other food crops. The hay and wheat was mostly exported to the New England states. Hay primarily to fuel the transportation system at the time, which was horses, right? And so they did this on a very big scale. It was a community effort. It was a major part of their identity and who they became were these very successful farmers. They were able to convert tens of thousands of acres into these fertile fields. Okay, but the problem with where they had settled is that area had been contentious between the British and the French, going back for several battles and several wars several treaties, and that area continued to change hands from the British to the French, back to the British, back to the French, for multiple generations until the ending of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, where the French ceded all this territory, the northeastern Canada, to the British. And all this time, throughout all this tumult, there always was a British governor or a British politician who ruled over the land, ruled over the French-speaking Acadians. So there was a compromise. The Acadians lived underneath this British rule, but they lived peacefully. And so long as they could keep their families, their farms, their French language, and their Catholic Church intact, and no one bothered them, then they could care less who was the ruling owner of this particular land. But all that changed in about the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, where the British were becoming really suspect of what they called the French neutrals. Okay, this was early exploration, the whole development of the United States. The country was going to war. The American colonies were going to war with the British over the 13 colonies. So there was a lot of animosity and fear, particularly from the British. And they decided that the best way to deal with this very large French Acadian population, which numbered around 15,000, was to get rid of them, was to round them up, was to separate the men from the women and children, to burn their homes and farms, to place them on ships, and to send them away to where they could never again recollect and come back to Acadia, the original Acadia. And so this is the story of the Grand Arrangement, which is a very important piece of our history, of North American history, and certainly a pivotal moment in the history of the Acadians. So who or what is a Cajun? It's a controversial question within the academic community. And it's been a topic of discussion for well over 100 years now, right? Defining what is a Cajun. Okay, so technically, the word Cajun is a derivative of the name Acadian. So when the Acadians fled from the Canadian Maritime Provinces in the 1760s and got scattered to the wind for what was known as the Grand Arrangement, when they were expelled from their homelands in Acadie, these were French-speaking farmers who had developed this very rich, fertile farmland in what is today Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, okay? The home to the original ancestral Acadians, my ancestors, Theriots, Bourgeois, Bourques, Cormiers, Comos, Doucets. These are all the people who lived in these communities and farmed and prospered. They were booted out by the British in the 1750s, and in 1765 began arriving in droves in South Louisiana. Those were the Acadians. Fast forward 200 years later, the term Acadian became Cajun simply by simply by the way that Anglos, English-speaking Anglos, referred to the dominant French-speaking peoples of South Louisiana. L'Acadien is how you would say Acadian. Je suis Acadien. I am an Acadian. Well, the English-speaking people heard Cajun. Cajun? Who are these people? The Cajuns. That's how the term became Cajun from Acadian. So as I said, technically speaking, Cajun people are ancestors of the original Acadians from Acadie in Nova Scotia. Now, that's sort of the technical aspect of it. But over the last 150, 200 years, those French-speaking Acadian Cajuns intermarried amongst other groups, other French-speaking groups in Louisiana, because there was more than just the Cajuns. In fact, if you look at places like Point Capee, which is sort of center of central Louisiana, heavy on the original French population. There were French from the Caribbean islands. Okay, there were people that came from France that settled in primarily in New Orleans. So New Orleans is not Cajun country, but the Cajun country is defined as the area in which the original Acadians settled. It's a multi-parish area in southern Louisiana from Lake Charles area all the way to, let's say, Terrebonne Parish, with the main cities being Lafayette, Morgan City, Abbeville, Houma, New Iberia, Lake Charles, these areas right in there, Eunice, the home of Cajun music. These are the areas that came to be known as Acadiana. And there's an actual flag, the National Acadian flag, and we wear it with pride and we fly it all the time. And so that sort of cultural identity really began to take shape in the 1960s and 70s during the cultural revival movements that were going on in the United States, right? You had the Mexican-American movements, particularly in California. You had Native Americans, okay? Obviously, civil rights movements. So you had all these different groups that were really clinging to their identity beginning in the 60s, and certainly really, pushing forward with those sort of ideals in the 1970s with big festivals and the recognition of this unique cuisine, this Cajun cooking that was sort of becoming realized, right, in the 1970s and 80s. The music, the Cajun music, finally becoming popular outside of Cajun country in the 1960s and 70s. As I had talked about before, the preservation of the French language. In 1968, the state of Louisiana passed a law that created the Council of Development of French in Louisiana, CODEFIL for short, which was the first time that a group of state legislatures, many of them with the last names of LeBlanc and Hébert and Guidry, these were the guys who said, we've got to preserve our French language. And so the state of Louisiana formally created a program designed to do that, designed to preserve that language and the culture, and ultimately provided funding for French immersion programs in the schools to start with the lower education and to teach the young people how to speak French.
I'm Jack Cagle, and I have the privilege of serving you as the Commissioner of Harris County Precinct 4. And today I want to thank you for joining us on our Encore Excursions. This is our way of getting you, our friends, our folks that we seek to serve, out and to be able to see the things that we used to be able to see together, but now safely and virtually. In the meantime, we hope to continue to bring other events and other excitement to you. Stay safe, stay well, and we hope to see you soon in person.